In the previous instalment of this podcast, I promised to get on with the second one that would posit a philosophy that would give local knowledge, farmer knowledge, knowledge based on the experience of working the land, to posit a philosophy that could really support the case for taking that kind of knowledge seriously. And I mentioned the name of John Dewey, and in this podcast I'd just like to introduce some of the aspects that I believe he allows that discussion to open up and move us beyond the elitisms that we still cling to, that in Western thought, within modern philosophy, that are the legacy in particular of the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, which, as in the first episode, I do see a great deal of value in. He was a great philosopher, and he understood a great many things, including about beauty and the meaning of beauty and what it tells us about our own nature. But as outlined in that episode, some of the rules that he built up to support his case excluded a direct utilitarian nature to place, which therefore means that he kind of ruled out the farmer's relationship to land as one that could be understood as truly aesthetic. Now, it's significant that Dewey and the circle of fellow philosophers at the turn of the last century, in the early decades of the 20th century, it's significant that that was coming out of America. European thought still to this day, when it looks at experience, is still trapped in a whole set of dualisms: mind, body, person, world, so on and so forth, that in spite of its best efforts it cannot escape from. There was something about that move of European thought over to America that enabled it to lose some of those binaries and find a horizon that existed at those boundaries, which allowed those boundaries to be dissolved. The fact that the movement was referred to as pragmatism, other philosophers included William James, Charles Peirce, and sat alongside, in some ways, the works of Emerson, Thoreau, Walt Whitman. It was a more direct relation to nature. And Dewey in particular really rejected the separation of nature and culture that still does so much damage to our conduct towards the environment. And my fixation on Dewey is that I think he is a philosopher of such magnitude that he is one of very few who has the, shall we call it, the tectonic weight in his thinking to challenge Kantian norms. So what is it about Dewey that will allow us to give credence, greater credence, to farmers' knowledge and people who work the land as being authoritative? The key really is in the word experience. For European philosophy, experience is something that essentially is thought to happen in the mind. So there's a world that exists. There are our senses, which are like a window onto that world. And then there's our minds, which take that material from the senses and turn it into experiences. For Dewey, he saw this as a failure, this model of experience. He saw that as failing to understand the true nature of what experience is and what a creature is. There are two books in particular that are critical to understanding his alternative view of experience. And the first of these was Experience and Nature, and the second one was Art as Experience. The second is a slightly more famous book. Now for Dewey, aesthetic experience, which Kant himself wrote a whole critique on, which was discussed in the first episode, aesthetic experience is the kind of experience which, this is all very difficult to articulate, that's why I've taken a while to produce this episode. Aesthetic experience of place through interacting with it is, in a sense, a window onto the evolutionary nature of experience. We think of evolution as being the evolution of organisms adapting to environments. Now, Dewey was one of the first philosophers to really wrestle with the meanings of evolution. And he put the trajectory, he rendered the trajectory of evolution in slightly different terms. He thought of it not so much as the evolution of organisms, but the evolution of experience. And he doesn't place experience in the heads of the organisms in the way that I described just before. But he places it as something that, yes, it involves the organism, but it also involves the environment. So experience, if we want to understand experience, then you can't isolate it to a set of perceptions that you're having inside your mind. Experience is actually something that is taking place in the environment, involving the organism. Now that's quite a profound thought, actually. Thinking about your own experience at this moment. It's actually part of it is in the place and time. There's a phase of what you are which is in the place you inhabit. The poetry of John Clare is very interesting for revealing some of this. It articulates how he is continuous with the particularities of a given place. It's not a question of perceiving that place, it's a question of being that place, of part of one's own being. Is attached. Is constituted by that place. So when you work a farm, when you work a landscape, continuously, day in, day out, over years, you can imagine the degree to which your entire being as a person is locked up in the land and the nature that you're working. You can't isolate the farmer as a being from the land that he or she farms. They are continuous, absolutely continuous. So my contention is, and I'm going to wrap this up now because it could go on for a long time trying to convey the subtlety of this. And the interesting thing is, Dewey was out of fashion for a long time. He didn't fare well in the kind of the slightly macho milieu of Anglo-American philosophy in the 20th century. Even though he was a great public figure during his lifetime, he was somewhat eclipsed afterwards. But with the pressure of the environmental crisis, there is a recognition that these philosophers who have started to undo some of these binaries of person and world and mind and body are perhaps the ones who can provide us with the type of thinking that can help us to address the situation that we find ourselves. And Dewey, along with philosophers of the same era like Alfred North Whitehead, who understood the individual as not being confined to their skin, that the epidermis was not the edge of being. These types of philosophers who saw this, their stars are starting to rise, and I'm certainly going to do my bit to bring Dewey's thinking more into play as a way of honouring the kinds of knowing which comes through co-identifying with landscape, through being the landscape, and the landscape being you. That the kinds of understanding that come from those type of relationships, these are the kinds of understanding that are going to come into their own as we adapt to the changes that our older, more exploitative, our more binary modes of thinking have delivered in terms of the crisis.